Good afternoon. Thank you for joining with us on short notice. I am honored and pleased to be in attendance with Mayor Lori Lightfoot, Superintendent David Brown, as well as members, Alderperson Emma Mitz, back here on the west side. A few months ago, this community was shaken and devastated by a brazen shootout in the streets. It left all of us as Chicagoans and Cook County residents wondering how much more we could take in terms of the violence and the brazenness of it. At the time, our office committed to working with the Chicago Police Department to bring charges where charges were appropriate. Oftentimes, the speed in which we are able to bring justice feels painful. But I am pleased today to announce, in collaboration with the Chicago Police Department and their detectives in coordination with the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, that we are bringing charges forth related to the guns that were involved in this instance. Today's charges are an example of how the system works through collaboration and the fact that we are all working together to keep our communities safe. As I said before, and will continue to say, that the Cook County State's Attorney's Office will make charging decisions based on the facts, the evidence, and the law, no matter how long it takes to get the result. Charges were approved today, this afternoon, by our assistants in felony review for the defendant, Thomas Dean, age 20. He's been charged with 3 counts of aggravated unlawful use of a weapon, that weapon having been an automatic weapon or machine gun, which makes this a Class X felony. The sentencing range for a Class X felony is 6 to 30 years for each count. I will point out that this is a continuing investigation, and while this is the first of the charges that we are announcing today, we anticipate that there will be further charges announced in the coming days related to this incident. Currently, we have a search warrant approved for another suspect in this instance. Bond court will be tomorrow at Central Bond Court at noon, room 102. There will be availability for press to participate by way of Zoom. At this time, I'd like to call to the podium Superintendent David Brown, who I once again thank he and his detectives for their tireless efforts over the course of these last several months, working in collaboration with our office to bring some measure of justice to this community. I thank him for his partnership. Superintendent Brown.
Thank you, State's Attorney Kim Foxx, and thank you, Mayor, and those on the podium to being here today to announce these charges. Just a little bit of more detail related to the charges. The Chicago Police Department, working with the Great Lakes Fugitive Task Force, apprehended Dean in the 2800 block of West Monroe Street. These counts obviously stem from the October 1st shootout. That day, occupants from 2 vehicles started shooting at a residence on the block. Occupants from the house returned fire. 1 offender was struck and killed in the street. Dean, who was arrested and charged, was also injured and dropped off at a hospital. Firearms were later recovered in 1 of the vehicles, and 1 was linked to Dean through DNA analysis. I can only imagine the trauma to the hearts and minds of residents up and down the block that day as they took cover in their own homes. Our homes are supposed to be safe places, places of refuge, peace, not fear and violence. There was no rhyme or reason for a gunfight in broad daylight, and every resident deserves better. No resident should be faced with that kind of terror. Brazen, reckless, and lawless acts of violence like these will not go unchecked, and offenders like Dean will not be let off the hook. Again, I want to thank the officers, the state's attorney, for their tireless work and for always seeking justice. It's not easy work. It's very passionate work, but it is work that matters, and we will keep at it in every community. Chicago Police Department and its officers work every day to hold all of those who break the law and make our neighborhoods unsafe accountable. And we won't ever stop. We won't ever let up. Because every Chicagoan deserves a safe city. And if I may take the liberty to talk about a second case where we charge someone with first-degree murder, I'll take those liberties now. First-degree murder charges were recently approved today, secured against Michael Cooper, arrested for a homicide that occurred in 400 block of North Laramie on January 10th, 2022. Officers responded to a shot spotter and discovered the victim. Pod camera showed the suspect walked up from behind the victim and then shot the victim multiple times. We also recovered video of the suspect entering the CTA. Area 4 detectives released video on social media to generate tips. A subject called Area 4 and was able to identify the suspect. 2 additional individuals also identified the suspect. But here's what's interesting about this case that should be encouraging to all of us. Our officers were working the protests against the early release of former Officer Van Dyke. At that protest there on Federal Plaza, there were many people in the crowd who wanted more charges brought on Van Dyke federally. Someone in that crowd approached one of our commanders, one of the Chicago Police Department commanders, and gave him a tip regarding this murder. That tip closed the loop and brought forth these charges that I'm talking about today on this suspect for first-degree murder. So that individual who came forward identified the suspect, and this is the greatest example of what collaboration between detectives, the community, and the Cook County State's Attorney looks like. We were able to apprehend this suspect, and now he will be held accountable for this heinous crime. Think about the recounting of that TikTok just now. People protesting a police action where an officer was charged gives police from that same department information to solve the murder in the community. That's what trust looks like. We located that suspect and arrested him yesterday, and he has been charged with first-degree murder. Cooper will be held, this person charged will be held in bond court tomorrow, and more details about this case will be revealed at that time. And with that, I'll turn it over to the mayor of the city of Chicago, Mayor Laura Lightfoot. Mayor.
Thank you, Superintendent. Thank you, State's Attorney Kim Foxx. First, I want to make sure that it's not lost that we are here on the Great West Side of our city, a community that is rich, has great residents, and who deserve the same thing that we want all over our city, which is peace. We have standing with us today many longtime West Side stakeholders, people who truly love this community and understand the richness and greatness of this important community in our city. And I say this all the time because I believe it to be true. As the West Side goes, there goes Chicago. So important that we are here today in this moment to talk about this moment of reckoning. And I think the simple message of today is accountability. To the criminals who think that they can shoot up neighborhoods without any regard for the sanctity of life, we will be relentless in holding you accountable. No matter how long it takes, no matter the odds or the obstacles, we will hold you accountable. And here, I must thank the diligence of the Area 4 detectives who worked this case relentlessly and whose hard work and dedication made these charges possible. We owe them a debt of gratitude for their relentless, hard sacrifices and work. And to any other criminal who thinks that you can take life with no consequences, let me be clear, you are wrong. We have drawn the line, and we promise We will bring peace to these neighborhoods because that is what our residents deserve. So anyone else who thinks that they can act without accountability, no matter how long it takes, we will be coming for you. And another important message that I want to stress today is that of unity. I stand here with the state's attorney and the superintendent, united in our common purpose and commitment to bring peace to our residents. Now, we may not agree on every issue or every time, but make no mistake, we are united in our shared mission to make all of our neighborhoods safe. Whether it's here in Austin, Roseland, Inglewood, Hyde Park, Kenwood, or Sauganash, Beverly, Lincoln Park, Lakeview, or Streeterville. All of our residents yearn for peace and safety, and as leaders, we have a solemn obligation and commitment to do everything that we can, working in collaboration and working diligently to deliver on that sacred oath and promise, and we will. And let's be clear. Our common enemies, no matter where you reside, are guns, gangs, and poverty. And we must continue to strike hard blows against all of them every single day. We've got to hold people accountable who traffic in illegal guns. We've got to hold gang members who use those illegal guns to wreak havoc and chaos in neighborhoods. But in the long term, all of us understand that we cannot just arrest our way out of this problem. We have to invest our way out of this problem. And by investing, the root cause is the poverty. I said this before, and I'll say it again. We have to make sure that we give real opportunity for our young people to participate in the legitimate economy in neighborhoods. That's why we are making the kind of historic investments, and I hope transformative investments, that we are making all across the city, and particularly here in the West Side. We spent a lot of time in the West Side from the time that I got sworn in. And I will continue to be relentless in coming here and listening to stakeholders and making sure that we are uplifting the quality of life here on the West Side and the South Side and other areas of our city that are plagued with violence. That is what we must do every single day with intentionality and using data as our guide. I am confident that we will take back our neighborhoods from the criminals, and today is proof positive of our resolve to never give up on bringing those who are responsible to justice. So again, I want to thank the state's attorney and her team. I want to thank the superintendent and particularly the detectives of Area 4 and others who've worked diligently to make this moment possible. I want to thank the Alderwoman, who is a champion for her community always. Give her some applause, because it's true. And we're happy to take your questions at this time.
Thanks a lot, Mayor. Members of the media, we'll go down the line. We'll start with Charlie DeMar from CBS. I just ask that you keep your mask on while asking a question. We'll do 2 questions per reporter. Go ahead, Charlie.
Good afternoon. State's Attorney Foxx and Mayor, you publicly clashed over this case back in October. State's Attorney Foxx, you cited insufficient evidence at the time and also the mutual combatants explanation. What has changed since then?
I want to be clear, the state's attorney's office never said mutual combatants. Never. Not once. What has changed is what I said initially, is that we needed additional evidence to be able to bring sufficient charges. What I'm incredibly proud of is that the detectives who worked this case were undeterred. We were able to get some scientific and forensic evidence that didn't exist at the time to be able to trace this back to this defendant. And again, additional work that we're doing on others who are likely to be charged. And so the difference is that at this time we have sufficient evidence. It's what I said before, we cannot bring charges if we don't believe the evidence is sufficient. I'm very confident with the evidence that the detectives working with our office have gathered over the course of these last 3 months, and that is why you see charges being brought today.
Did anything change from that time? At the time, the mayor was confident that charges should have been brought, that there was a strong case. What has changed, in that time?
I'll tell you what hasn't changed is that we continue to work on this case with the Chicago Police Department and their detectives. We worked with them from that first weekend all the way until 2:33 this afternoon when these charges were approved. What is different, as I said, is that we've been able to gather more forensic evidence, more other circumstantial evidence to be able to bring these charges forth today. So that's what's changed. This is how it's supposed to work. As the mayor said, sometimes it takes time. And we understand what we saw was horrific, and people want answers and accountability. What we want is a conviction. What we want for the people who did this to this neighborhood, who had people fearful of leaving their homes, who made this city a national conversation piece once again for violence, what we don't want is to rush a charge and not get that conviction. Accountability this is step one. Step two is this person will appear in bond court, and then eventually we'll get to trial. And it is our hope at the Cook County State's Attorney's Office that we're able to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt and get a conviction so that there is accountability. That's what this is about. Accountability so that the people of the Austin community know that their leaders are working together to keep their communities safe.
Do you anticipate that there could be murder charges throughout this case?
We're going to look at all the evidence and bring charges where appropriate. And again, it's an ongoing collaborative effort between ourselves and the Chicago Police Department.
Alyssa Donovan, WGN.
Hi there. I have a question for Superintendent Brown, and actually this is about a different case. There was a young man in bond court today, 16-year-old Anthony Brown, for the shooting of 15-year-old Michael Brown. I wanted to ask you, he was on electronic monitoring. How was he able to get out and kill another teen?
So one of the things that we've consistently focused on is the electronic monitoring program. In its public record, we've asked for a strong look, as well as the mayor's asked for a moratorium on the electronic monitoring program for various reasons. But that shouldn't distract from this tragedy regarding this 15-year-old who was killed and his family's grief-stricken mother, who many of you have interviewed and talked with about this case. So we have our strong opinion. We've expressed that. I'm not going to go over that again today. I'm on the record strongly for some changes. The mayor's wrote a letter strongly asking for a moratorium to take a second look at how we're assessing risk as it relates to people who are not held until trial. So again, not to belabor the point, we want to focus on, and this happens many times, the questions about violence and its behavior lays at the feet of those perpetrators. And by having conversations about everything but what they did and that they're held accountable is not what the public expects from us. This person, Dean, is now being charged with serious felonies, and he'll be in bond court. I recounted a second charge on that happened regarding murder. Let's lay violence at the feet of the perpetrators and not distract between other things, because it's really important, number one, for the families to hear clearly from us that we're on the same page, focused on bringing people to justice. And that's enough for these families. The families are not tuned into how we got here. They want people held accountable. And that's what we're talking about today, and we're going to stay focused on that. And perpetrators and other offenders out there that are listening to us, we're coming for you. You did not get away with the crimes because you have been delayed in the justice that these families, this community, and this city deserve. So I just wanted to spend more words talking about bringing offenders to justice than I did on EM or other distractions that who families who grieve could care less about. Thank you.
Paul, ABC 7. Go ahead, Greg.
Superintendent, or not superintendent, State Attorney Foxx, can you elaborate a little more? It seems like a long time has gone by, and just kind of picking up on what Charlie was saying, did this new forensic evidence just come back now? Because if I'm not mistaken, you had the gun since the day of the crime. It was recovered at the crime. Did it just take this long to process it, or, I mean, you had this guy in custody as well?
Yes, Craig. It took this long because we're dealing with the crime lab as well to do analysis. At the time on that weekend, we had not had that analysis done. As I said, since that time period, the Chicago Police Department and their detectives have been relentless in securing the forensic evidence, turning that evidence over to the Illinois State Police Crime Lab, getting that information back, and again, being able to connect the dots as best we can. We know forensics is but one piece. Using the other circumstantial evidence to support this is how we got here today. But as of that first weekend, we did not have the forensic evidence that we now have today that gives us the confidence to bring charges.
Just clarifying, you're saying this just came back recently? This forensic just came back from the lab recently?
It's come back since the time of the original shooting. So the original shootout happened on a Friday. I think we did not file charges that weekend because we did not have this information. Since then, we have gotten that information and have built a circumstantial case in addition to the forensics. So I will say it is recent. Since the original shooting back in October.
And is Mr. Dean the person in that white hoodie who was seen firing shots before he himself gets shot?
I'm not describing Mr. Dean at this point. What I will tell you is there will be a bond hearing tomorrow where we will lay out the specifics of the case and the identifications and how we brought this case forward.
Superintendent, could you clarify that, if he's that individual that we've seen in the video?
Again, this needs to come out in bond court with the attorneys that are going to be prosecuting this case. I'm not going to preempt what's going to happen in bond court with more detail. We were detailed enough to tell the story of how we got here. This person will be held accountable, and those further details will be held out in bond court as the state's attorney just recounted. Thanks.
All right, Craig Pratt, Tribune.
Well, you know, when this, you guys are talking about unity, and obviously the state's attorney and the police and city hall all do need to work together and collaborate. This was a pretty ugly episode between your sides in October. The public dispute, it got pretty nasty. How do you, going forward, when you do have disagreements, as the mayor alluded to, that there will be disagreements sometimes, how do you not have it devolve into that level of public conflict?
I'll start. Look, this was a pretty extraordinary set of circumstances where you had literally a shootout, like something you'd see in a Wild Wild West movie in broad daylight on a residential street. And I think emotions were very high at the time. I know mine were. I think all of us were. We were appalled at what we saw and wanted some accountability. And we had very candid conversations about what that would look like. But ultimately, the state's attorney makes the decision on what the charges are. And we resolved that we would continue to be focused on it. And as the detective division could tell you in my weekly meetings with them, I, every week, ask for updates. Where are we? Where are we? Where are we? And, you know, the state's attorney, rightfully so, as she said, wants proof beyond a reasonable doubt, to be confident that when they bring charges, the charges will stick. And I certainly understand that. And again, we're not going to agree on every issue. This isn't some false show of unity. But as I said, and I believe, our unity comes from our individual and collective commitment to do everything possible to both prevent crimes from happening in the first instance, but also that when something does happen, to be relentless in bringing the perpetrators of the crime to justice. And that's what I think these charges today are really all about.
Tom Schuba.
Well, actually, I'd like the state's attorney's response on that as well.
Thank you. I agree with the mayor. If you saw that video of what, it wasn't a video game, it was somebody's neighborhood. There are people who live there. And I think what's really important, and I have a difficult job too. Probably not as difficult as this one. But there's a sense when something happens, I understand that you've got a deadline to meet, that there's a story that needs to be told. And sometimes the difficulty of this job is that the information isn't as fast as you need it. That we can't summarize or sum up things so quickly without cutting corners. And so I understood the mayor's passion that Monday. That you watch this shootout and you hear that we haven't filed charges. I understood that. And what I said, and I said to the mayor then and continue to say to the mayor now as we work on these issues, is that I have an obligation as a prosecutor to only bring cases when the evidence supports it. And what I was hoping for, just as a public discourse, as a lawyer who doesn't get to speak much about pending cases, that we weren't going to talk about disagreements between the mayor and I while people were afraid to send their children outside their homes. I recognize the sexiness of a conversation about leaders combating one another. There was nothing sexy about what happened here. These people live in neighborhoods that have been devastated by violence, and the last thing they want to hear about are their leaders fighting. I grew up in Cabrini in the 70s and 80s, when the violence levels that we are seeing now pale in comparison. And I don't remember my mother, when she had me secreting away from gun violence in bathtubs, talking about the differences between Mayor Belandic and whoever the police chief was at the time. She wanted me to be safe. And so while I get that we wrote a lot about it, about the passion that was rooted in, we both agreed that no one living in this neighborhood should live like that. And how we get to today, that's what we were focused on. I've also said, and I said the day after, where my passions were high as well, because I did not want for a moment anyone in this neighborhood to believe that if there were charges that I could have brought on that day, that I would ignore their community. It's my community. And so I'm a little fired up today because I hope that as we move forward in talking about the devastating impacts of violence in our communities, that we focus on the people who are subjected to it and hold us as leaders accountable to working collaboratively and collectively to solve for it. And that's what's happened. You asked what's changed. The public has demanded that we put all hands on deck to solve for this violence. And what you are seeing is just one section of the hands of this great city and county working to do that.
Thank you. Tom Schuba, Sun-Times.
Hi, Mayor. You said that the message today is accountability, and you stressed that people in this community on the west side in Austin deserve a sense of peace. Yet, you know, we saw that jarring video, multiple people out front shooting at one another. But most of those individuals who were in that video and who police initially tried to bring charges have not been charged, and no one has been charged with any crime directly related to the shooting.
Well,
what can you say-
I don't agree with that, but finish.
What do you say to people on the west side in Austin when these individuals are still roaming free despite having engaged in a shootout like this?
Well, let's take stock. My recollection from the video, there were really four main actors. Two on the outside of the house, well, three. Two on the outside of the house and at least one person inside the house firing out. One of the people outside was killed that day. So there's not much we can say beyond that. One of the other people has now been, of the other remaining two, has now been brought to justice. I'm not going to opine about anything else because, as the state's attorney said, this is an ongoing investigation. But again, I think the point and what I say and will say to the people of Austin is we never give up. We will work diligently to bring those accountable to justice. And we are not going to let Austin or any other neighborhood turn into the wild, wild west where people are not held accountable for what they do. And my hope is that by this show today, but in particular the charges, and what I hope happens in bond court tomorrow, is that we send a very clear message to those who may be thinking about picking up a handgun or a rifle or any other kind of firearm and just shooting indiscriminately, that there will be consequences and a cost for doing so. We can't continue to be silent. And when I say we, I mean everybody. The challenges that we're seeing in violence in our neighborhoods cannot be solved by one mayor alone, one superintendent, one state's attorney, no matter how willing, how well-intentioned. We can't solve these problems by ourselves because the reality is they are decades in the making. You know, the state's attorney talked about growing up in Cabrini Green in the 70s and 80s. That, again, do your homework. What was the yearly homicide rate back then, like 1,000 homicides a year with regularity. So, yeah, we are in a very challenging time, and our residents have every right to demand better and more, but we've got to also focus on getting away from this cycle of violence once and for all. And the only way I know that we can do that is by giving those young men who are drawn to the street a different trajectory for their lives. And that is the only way that ultimately we're going to be able to get out of this continuous cycle of spikes and troughs and spikes and troughs. And we've got to do that at the same time. We're doing things like this, which is striking hard blows against guns and gangs and the violent people who pick them up and use them to perpetrate crimes against our residents. We can't ever give up on that. But at the same time, as the Alderwoman knows, as Carl Brinson knows, we've got to make sure that we're investing in these neighborhoods. There are too many neighborhoods in which young boys are drawn to a street life. They're vulnerable. They come from poor families. And gangs dangle the promise of a better life in front of them. And being young, and in many instances, with all the impulse control issues, they're looking for something too. But what I hope that we put in front of them is opportunity and hope and love. That's what we need to be also focused on. And so I recognize that people all over the city are afraid. I get it. That's why I made the point earlier about this is a collective issue, and we are in a moment where we have to come together as a city and solve this problem as a city. But part of where we need to do the work is giving these young people something that blocks the continual, relentless pipeline to the streets. And I hear that from young men and women all over the city. What they want is hope. What they want is love. What they want is investment. And feeling like their lives have actual meaning and resonance to people in our city. You know, it's not okay that now that the violence has spread to other areas that haven't historically experienced it, that now suddenly we feel like there's a crisis. There are people that are living in this community and Roseland and Inglewood and other parts of our city that live in a daily crisis and have for decades. Decades. So we've got to step up in this moment. I believe, and I know this to be true through this pandemic, every moment gives us opportunity to do better, even in the worst of times. And we're in one of those moments. And we will be judged by what we do in this moment. Not to just put a Band-Aid on a decades-long problem, but to do something real and meaningful and foundational, and again, dare I say, transformative. Our young people, their families, our city deserves no less.
Kim, I just had a question for you too. I know that,
I'm going to say that's State's Attorney Foxx.
oh, excuse me, State's Attorney Foxx. Excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Schuba.
Yes. I know that initially some of these individuals were, the effort was to charge them under the felony murder rule, and there's been some writing and discussion about this recently and the changes. This is from my colleague Matt Hendrickson. Do you support the changes to the felony murder rule? And if so, what charges could prosecutors pursue in cases like Melinda Crump's that address the death of the person, not just the weapons violation?
Certainly. So I was a supporter and continue to be a supporter of the Safety Act, which was passed and signed into legislation last year. What the Safety Act did, and again, I think it's important for our reporting for clarity, just so that we don't get the wrong message out there. The Safety Act did not repeal the felony murder rule. It didn't repeal it. But it did change our office's ability to pursue first-degree murder charges under the doctrine. Previously, under the doctrine, we had an agent, what we call an agency theory, and it is now moved to a proximate cause theory. The proximate cause theory, that theory of felony murder, is more in line with jurisdictions across this country. The previous felony murder rule set Illinois out as an outlier. So what does it mean? Essentially, a defendant can no longer be charged or convicted of felony murder when the death during the felony was caused by someone other than the defendant or another participant in the underlying felony. So I have an example here. Under the agency theory, if two offenders were robbing a bank and the security guard fired a weapon at them and then killed one of the offenders, the other offender could have been charged with that murder, the murder of his co-offender. However, under the proximate cause theory, because the death was caused by the security guard and not any of the offenders, then the surviving offender cannot be charged with the murder. However, he can be charged with the underlying crime, which was the robbery. And so what we are seeing is, and again, we've had these two cases that have come to the attention, and the instinct to be able to create a narrative based on those two cases is not looking at what we saw historically in the overuse, and I dare say the misuse of the felony murder rule. And as a result, those who engage in this behavior, who are arrested, who we have sufficient evidence to charge, we will be going for accountability in those cases. In the cases that were cited earlier this week, both of those cases can see the defendant, if convicted, serve more than a decade in prison for their crimes.
Thank you, everyone. That's a wrap. Thanks, Mayor.